Welcome, everyone, to Ohio Unsolved. I'm your host, Matthew, and I just have one announcement for today. Next week is a week off for the podcast, but we will be back on March 1st with a brand new episode. Today's episode is about serial killer Carl Watts, the Sunday morning slasher. So let's just get into it. Everyone sit back, make sure to lock your doors and windows, and get ready for Ohio Unsolved. Carl Eugene Watts, also known by his nickname Coral, was a serial killer who was dubbed the Sunday morning slasher, who murdered numerous women and girls over an 8-year period. He is suspected of being the most prolific serial killer in United States history. He died of prostate cancer while serving 2 sentences of life imprisonment without parole in a Michigan prison for the murders of Helen Dutcher and Gloria Steele, although the number of his victims may have exceeded 100. Carl Watts was born in Killeen, Texas, to Richard Eugene Watts and Dorothy Mae Young on November 7, 1953. His father was a private first class in the Army, and his mother was a kindergarten art teacher. They had married in Colwood, West Virginia. Before Carl was born in 1942, Richard was transferred to Killeen and assigned to Fort Hood Army Base because it was chosen as the site for the American Army's tank destroyer tactical and firing center. 3 days after his birth, they returned to West Virginia, where they had grown up, and a year later, Sharon, their second child, was born. Carl's parents divorced when he was less than 2 years old due to an unsatisfactory marriage, and his mother raised him. In 1962, Dorothy Mae married Norman Caesar, a mechanic, with whom she had 2 daughters. The two moved to Inkster, Michigan, where she found employment as a high school art teacher. Carl disliked his new stepfather, which made it difficult for him to adapt to his new familial environment. Carl claimed that he was referred to as a mama's boy, and that he often worried about losing his mother's attention. Dorothy Mae, Carl, and Sharon frequently visited Dorothy's mother and family in Colwood, where Dorothy was born and raised. In the rural region near his grandmother's home, Carl learned how to hunt and skin rabbits with his grandfather, an activity that he really enjoyed. Carl later adopted the nickname Coral, which was the southern pronunciation of his name, as a result of Carl's passion for the southern town and his native cousins. Carl repeatedly had academic difficulties in Inkster, but yet he managed to get decent grades. Him and his sister contracted meningitis when he was 8 years old, which nearly killed him and caused him to be held back a year and miss the 3rd grade. Carl was brought to the Herman Kiefer Hospital, where he had to be kept apart from other patients and undergo spinal taps. Journalists claim that Carl's body temperature was so high that physicians worried it might have caused brain damage. After his illness, his family members also noticed a change in his personality, describing him as bashful, quiet, and introverted. His attention span dropped, and he began to suffer from a poor memory. Carl struggled to keep up with other pupils when he returned to school, since he had been held back one grade and had experienced chronic sleeplessness as a result of his sickness. Carl started having violent dreams about battling off and killing the wicked spirits of women, which interrupted his sleep cycle. When detectives questioned him about his crimes and asked him why he killed women, he responded that he wanted to, quote, free their spirits because they had evil eyes. By the time he was 12 years old, according to Carl, he began to relish his sleep-induced fantasies of torturing and killing girls and young women. Teenage Carl started stalking girls at this time, and it is thought that he killed his first victim before the age of 15. He frequently received failing grades in school, and by the age of 16, he could only read at a 4th grade level. He was severely bullied as well. The police were able to identify a 15-year-old Carl as a culprit in the assault on 26-year-old Joan Gave on June 29, 1969. While delivering newspapers on his route, Carl knocked on Gave's apartment door. He then beat her when she opened and abused her violently. He then continued on his delivery route as if nothing happened. Gave immediately contacted the police, who apprehended Carl at his home. He was ordered to undergo psychiatric treatment at the Lafayette Clinic in Detroit, a mental hospital. During a psychiatric evaluation, Carl was asked if his dreams and nightmarish visions disturbed him, and he replied, "No, I feel better after I have one," and claimed that they were not nightmares because he enjoyed them. He further elaborated that his motivation for assaulting Gave was because he, quote, just felt like beating someone up. According to a psychiatric assessment, Carl was revealed to have mild intellectual disability with an IQ of 75 and to have a delusional thought process and no evidence of psychosis. However, a police officer interrogating him after his arrest later stated that he appeared to be very, very intelligent with an excellent memory. Also, Carl's psychiatrist later reported that he was an impulsive individual who had a passive-aggressive orientation to life and who is struggling for control of strong homicidal impulses. He thought Carl posed a threat to society and hoped that the adolescent would benefit from outpatient therapy. He was discharged from the Lafayette Clinic on his 16th birthday and visited the facility 9 more times for outpatient care throughout the ensuing years. During his time in various mental institutions, Carl was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder. Carl graduated from high school in 1973 at the age of 19, and he was given a football scholarship to Lane College in Jackson, Tennessee, despite his subpar grades and sporadic drug use after his release. Carl said that exercising allowed him to let out his suppressed rage. He was able to achieve stardom as a football player and even greater success in boxing, becoming a Golden Gloves fighter. After just 3 months, he was dismissed from Lane College after being charged with stalking and assaulting women and receiving minor leg injuries. The fact that many people at Lane College thought Carl was a suspect in the violent killing of a female student, even though there was insufficient evidence to hold him accountable for the crime, was another factor in his expulsion. He briefly resided in Houston, Texas, following his expulsion, and then spent a year working as a mechanic for a Detroit wheel manufacturer. In 1974, Carl entered to Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, and a string of heinous assaults and attacks on women started to occur. Carl's first confirmed murders took place when he was 20 years old in 1974, by kidnapping his victims from their homes, torturing them, and then murdering them. He attacked in several different jurisdictions and even different states. Most of his victims were thin, attractive white women, and he used methods such as strangulation, stabbing, bludgeoning, and drowning. His victims ranged between the ages of 14 and 44. He murdered dozens of women between 1974 and 1982, and despite the many women he murdered, he was not discovered as a serial killer for almost 8 years. Even with the advent of DNA testing, it was still nearly impossible to connect them because he rarely performed sexual acts on his victims. His crimes were not thought to be sexually motivated. Carl may have been involved in the disappearance of Nadine Jean Odell, who was 16 years old when she disappeared on August 16, 1974. She was last seen walking down John Daly Street in Inkster, Michigan, on her way to babysit at her boyfriend's house in Taylor. Her body has never been found, and no one witnessed her presumed abduction. At 10:45 a.m. on October 25, 1974, Carl knocked on 23-year-old Lenore Kaniski's apartment door. Carl called for Charles, which was the name of one of his siblings, when she unlocked the door while the door was still chained. When she responded in the negative, she asked if he would like to leave a note, and she undid the chain lock and went to get paper. Carl then attacked her and choked her into unconsciousness. Police were later alerted by Lenore, but they were unable to find her attacker. Gloria Steele, 20, was tortured and brutally killed by Carl on October 30th, 1974. She is thought to have been his second victim. She attended Western Michigan University while raising her family. She was discovered with a crushed windpipe and 33 chest stab wounds from a wooden carving instrument. There were no witnesses other than Diane K. Williams, an apartment resident manager, who saw a black man, quote, searching for Charles, strolling throughout the complex of apartments. When Carl saw her, he grabbed her, pushed her door open, and dragged her inside her apartment. Her phone started to ring as the two were fighting, so she knocked it off the hook and yelled for help. Williams spotted the man getting into a tan Pontiac Grand Prix as she stood up and peered out the window after her attacker fled. The police assembled a lineup, and Williams and Kaninsky recognized Carl, who had just been apprehended stealing plywood from the campus of Western Michigan University. For both the Kaninsky and Williams cases, he was taken into custody and charged with assault and battery. After being diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and attempting suicide with a length of cord at the Kalamazoo Mental Hospital, Carl was moved to the Center for Forensic Psychiatry in Michigan. When Carl was questioned about the death of Steele in 1975, he acknowledged that he had been nearby the day before Gloria died, but he insisted that he had not killed her, despite having admitted to attacking around 15 other young women. When Detroit police executed a search warrant at Carl's residence, they discovered wooden carving tools, but no evidence connecting him to Gloria's death. He entered a no-contest plea at his trial for the assault and battery of Kaninsky and Williams, and was sentenced to a year in the county jail. His psychologist classified him as being extremely hazardous, lacking in remorse for his crimes, impetuous, careless, and emotionally distant, with a high likelihood of recidivism. Carl returned to Inkster after being released from prison in 1976 and moved in with his mother and stepfather. Carl impregnated Dolores Howard, a childhood friend, in 1979, and the two gave birth to Nikisha Watts. Shortly after, Carl and Dolores split up, and he soon after wed Valeria Goodwill. Goodwill claimed that shortly after their marriage, he started acting odd. He kept moving the furniture around, using knives to chop up houseplants, broke candles and melted them into the table, and dumped trash all over the floors without picking it up. He would also get up and depart after they had sex or had an intimate encounter, and would disappear for several hours at a time. Their marriage only lasted for 6 months. 5 women were attacked and killed in the Detroit region over the course of a year by a perpetrator who was dubbed by Ann Arbor newspapers as the Sunday Morning Slasher. Since all of the attacks took place on Sunday mornings at around 4 a.m., on October 31st, 1979, Jean Klein, a 44-year-old reporter for Detroit News, walked home after a doctor's appointment and was attacked. She was approached in broad daylight next to her Grosse Pointe Farms home on a major suburban road. 11 stab wounds resulted in her death. Insufficient evidence was discovered by the police to identify a suspect. Detectives initially suspected Janine's husband, but once Carl admitted to her murder, they ruled him out. Shirley Small, a 17-year-old high school student from Ann Arbor, was fatally stabbed twice in the heart outside of her home on April 20th, 1980. Glenda Richmond, 26, was the victim of a comparable assault on July 13th, 1980, in front of her summer residence in the Ann Arbor region. A diner manager, she sustained 28 knife wounds to her chest. At both crime scenes, there was insufficient evidence to convict anyone. However, both of the murders displayed characteristics of Carl's crimes. Graduate student Rebecca Huff of the University of Michigan was found dead on September 14, 1980, in front of her house. She had suffered about 50 stab wounds. Her case was the first homicide that could be directly attributed to Carl. A 20-year-old lady named Dalpe, D-A-L-P-E, Dalpe, was attacked and stabbed on October 6th, but managed to live. She ended up with partially paralyzed muscles. Weak muscles could hardly eat or move her head, and her arms barely moved over her head due to the deep slashes that she sustained to her face, one of which ruptured her jugular vein. On November 1st, Angus, a 30-year-old woman, spotted a black man wearing a hooded sweatshirt as she was making her way home from a Halloween party. She kept an eye on him. He bent down to tie his shoe as soon as she pulled out her keys and then immediately followed her. She ran to her front door while screaming at the top of her lungs. He was startled by her response, so he turned and fled the other way. She identified Carl Watts from a lineup of photos, but she was not sure because the outside area was dimly lit at the time of her attack. Canadian authorities also believe that Carl crossed the border into Windsor, Ontario that October, assaulting 20-year-old Sandra Dalpe outside her apartment, leaving her near death with multiple wounds to her face and throat, but she survived. By that time, Carl had fallen under scrutiny from local homicide investigators. A task force was organized in July 1980 to probe the Sunday slashings, and Carl was placed under sporadic surveillance. A November court order permitted officers to plant a homing device inside of his car. On November 15th, at around 5 in the morning, 2 police officers on patrol in the vicinity of Main Street in Ann Arbor saw a suspicious man in a car following a woman who was walking home. She attempted to hide in a doorway after realizing that she was being followed in the hopes that her stalker would lose her. Carl nearly went crazy when he lost track of the woman that he was pursuing. He was detained by the police after they pulled over his car for having outdated license plates in a suspended license. Additionally, they examined his car and discovered a package containing wood filling equipment and a few screwdrivers. Their most important discovery, however, was a dictionary that belonged to Huff and had the carved phrase, "Rebecca is a lover," on it. It was insufficient proof, though, to hold him responsible for her slaying. Carl relocated to Columbus, Texas in the spring of 1981, where he worked for an oil firm. He spent his weekend nights traveling more than 70 miles to his next hunting ground in the Houston region. Michelle Madej, then 20 years old, answered the door to her Houston apartment on May 23, 1982, to find a suspicious-looking man standing there. Unexpectedly, the stranger assaulted, beat, and choked her until she passed out. The man entered her bathroom, filled the tub with water, and drowned her while she was still lying on the floor before departing the area. Later that day, Melinda Aguilar, 18, and Lori Lister, 21, had their Houston apartment broken into by Carl. He choked Lister down the steps below the flat while she was returning from work. He then went inside the apartment and started to choke Melinda as well. Melinda pretended to be unconscious while Watts wire-tied her hands behind her back. In order to drown Lister, he hauled her body upstairs into the bathroom, where he filled the bathtub with water. Melinda was able to escape while Carl was focused on Lister and leapt out of a window to get assistance. Lister was saved, and Carl was apprehended after evading capture. While Carl was being held, investigators started to connect him to several recent killings of women. Prosecutors in Texas did not believe they had enough evidence to find Carl guilty of murder, though. In May 1982, after the attacks on Melinda and Lori, Harris County Assistant District Attorney Ira Jones brokered a plea bargain. Carl would only be charged with burglary with intent to murder if he confessed fully to his crimes and received immunity from prosecution on the murder accusations. A 60-year sentence was imposed for this offense. The deal was accepted, and he later led the detectives to the graves of 3 of his victims. Carl finally acknowledged attacking 19 women, murdering 13 of them. He also admitted to killing 44-year-old Jean Klein in Detroit in 1979, but he refrained from confessing to the deaths of Glenda Richard, Shirley Small, or Rebecca Huff. However, Michigan authorities refused to go in on the deal, so the cases in that state remained open. Linda Tilley, 22, a student of the University of Texas, was drowned in the swimming pool of her apartment complex in September of 1981, according to his confession. 1 week later, he also killed Elizabeth Montgomery, 25, by stabbing her. Susan Wolf, 21, was several steps away from her apartment when she was fatally stabbed in the arm and chest while going home after purchasing ice cream from a grocery store. Carl acknowledged another murder from January 1982, that of 27-year-old Phyllis Tam, who was attacked while jogging. Carl alleged that after choking her with his hands, he tied an elastic strap to a tree branch and hung her there. Margaret Fossey, a 25-year-old architecture student who appeared to have passed away from a strike to the throat, was murdered by Carl almost 2 days later. At Rice University, her body was discovered in the trunk of her vehicle. Carl claimed that he burnt her shoes, her pocketbook, the blueprints that she was carrying, and her belongings in an effort to, quote, destroy her spirit. Additionally, Carl said to authorities that on January 16th, he later saw Julia Sanchez, a young woman attempting to fix a flat tire on the road. Sanchez was left for dead after Carl sliced her throat. Despite this, though, she lived. Carl claimed to have assaulted 2 additional women in the Houston area that same month. Patty Johnson, then 19 years old, was attacked on January 30th, 1982, as she exited her car on her way home. Carl slashed her throat in an attempt to kill her. Carl left after hearing someone yell who had heard what was happening. Johnson survived, and up until Carl admitted guilt, another man had received a life sentence for the assault. The second victim Carl cited was Martell, a 19-year-old who had been attacked outside of her residence and stabbed 3 times with a screwdriver, but she managed to survive. Carl also admitted to killing Elena Samander, Emily Lacroix, Anna Ledette, Yolanda Garcia, Carrie Jefferson, Suzanne Searless, and Michelle Mayday between February and May of 1982. Carl was never put on trial for the majority of the murders, despite his confessions due to the agreement that he made. He was sentenced to the agreed 60 years in 1982. However, shortly after he began serving time, the Texas Court of Appeals ruled that he had not been informed that the bathtub and water that he attempted to drown Lori Lister in was considered a deadly weapon. The ruling reclassified him as a nonviolent felon, making him eligible for early release. At the time, Texas law allowed nonviolent felons to have 3 days deducted from their sentence for every 1 day served, as long as they were well behaved. Carl was a model prisoner and had enough time deducted from his sentence that he could have been released as early as May 9, 2006. The law allowing early release was abolished after public outcry, but cannot be applied retroactively according to the Texas Constitution. In 2004, Michigan Attorney General Mike Cox went on national television asking for anyone to come forward with information in order to try to convict Carl of murder to ensure that he was not released. Joseph Foy of Westland, Michigan came forward to say that he had seen a man fitting Carl's description murder Helen Dutcher, a 36-year-old woman who died after being stabbed 12 times on December 1, 1979. Foy identified Watts by his eyes, which he described as being, quote, evil and devoid of emotion. Although Carl had immunity from prosecution for the 13 killings that he had admitted to in Texas, he had no immunity agreement in Michigan. Before his 2004 trial, law enforcement officials asked the trial judge to allow the Texas confession into evidence, to which he agreed. Carl was promptly charged with the murder of Helen Dutcher. A Michigan jury convicted him on November 17, 2004, after hearing eyewitness testimony from Joseph Foy. On December 7th, he was sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 days later, authorities in Michigan started making moves to try him for the murder of Western Michigan University student Gloria Steele, who was stabbed to death in 1974. Carl's trial for the Steele murder began in Kalamazoo, Michigan on July 25, 2007. Closing arguments concluded July 26th. The following day, the jury returned a guilty verdict. Carl was sentenced to life in prison without parole on September 13th. He was incarcerated at a maximum security prison in Ionia, Michigan, until he died of prostate cancer on September 21, 2007, in a Jackson, Michigan hospital. The whole Texas letting him out is kind of surprising to me, because from what I know about Texas is they're pretty fond of the death penalty, so I'm surprised that they didn't go ahead and just use that for him. But our next story marks the return of ghost stories from yourghoststories.com. And this story is called The Old Maternity Hospital. And as always, I will be reading from the author's perspective. This particular account took place in the mid to late 1970s. I was still a relatively newlywed to my first husband, Bill. Bill worked on and off, but mostly off. Therefore, I had to work. I found employment as a nurse aide in a fairly large hospital in Willoughby, Ohio. I started there in 1974 and worked until 1977. We had moved from our first apartment to a very nice apartment in Euclid. However, having moved further away made it harder for me to commute to my job. So I had to secure new employment closer to our new residence, making it easier to transit back and forth. I found work in another hospital called Booth Memorial Hospital. It no longer exists. They didn't have any openings for nurses' aides, but needed housekeepers. I figured I'm not too proud. Work is work, and a paycheck is a paycheck. They hired me, and I started there in the latter part of 1977. Let me supply a little background on this hospital. It originally opened as a charity maternity hospital in 1902 and was expanded upon in 1904. They also opened a home for unwed mothers in 1907 that was operated with a hospital. It was called Booth Hospital at first, and then in the unwed mother's home was separate and built slightly adjacent to it on the right side behind the hospital. The hospital's name officially changed in 1923 to Booth Memorial Hospital. It was named after William Booth, the founder of the Salvation Army, who operated the facility. It was originally a small hospital, having only 54 beds when first opened, but when I went to work there in 1977, it had 3 floors and about 100 beds by then. Low-income families could also go there to have their babies, and they could temporarily house the husbands and other children of the women patients, thus allowing them to be close by. The unwed mother's home had 3 floors. The girls living there were expected to do chores to earn their keep. They also were given education and job training in the event that they decided to keep their babies. For the most part, though, back in the 1900s to 1950s, unwed females were often viewed by the state as unfit mothers. Thus, the children became wards of the state and were placed in foster homes or adopted out to middle-income families that could afford to raise and educate them. You have to understand that it was a much different time period, and they frowned upon unwed mothers back then. We scarcely raise an eyebrow about single parents nowadays, but back then it was a whole different mindset. I could tell that the building had a lot of history behind it by the architecture. I met and made immediate friends with a woman that I'll call Trish. She was a divorcee with a young son. Her ex wasn't giving her any child support, so she had to work to make ends meet for her son and herself. Back in the 70s, the state didn't go after men to make support payments like they do now. Trish and I often worked together on the same floors. We encountered many senior personnel with their navy blue uniforms on. They had captains, sergeants, and corporals, not unlike the military. They mostly operated the home out back, but would come to the hospital to assist the nursing staff with the patients, or to work in the nurseries. They had 3 nurseries, 1 on each floor. We had utility rooms to store our carts and supplies on the first floor. There were about 4 utility rooms, 1 in each wing. We had additional storage for our supplies down in the basement. Like I said, Trish and I connected and got along right away. My first couple weeks there, Trish would always insist on our going to the basement together and not alone. I didn't really question her about that, as I thought she was just being concerned about my getting lost down there. That was a definite possibility, since it was a maze of hallways with a multitude of rooms on either side of the halls. Not to mention the shipping and receiving docks, boiler room, kitchen supply, housekeeping articles, and yes, the morgue was located down there. We could access the basement via the elevator or the stairway. However, I learned quickly where everything was located. One day, I was headed toward the elevator to go down to fetch some supplies when Trish noticed me and asked me where I was going. I told her I was just going to the basement to get some things for the utility room. She told me that she would come with me. I exclaimed that she didn't have to, since I knew my way around down there, but she insisted. About then, she piqued my curiosity, and I asked her why. She said that she would explain after we got what we needed and came back up. We got our supplies, and we came back up to the first floor, at which point I awaited her explanation. She invited me into the lounge because she said that we could talk better in there. The lounge was empty. We seated ourselves on a couch by the window. She then let out a nervous sigh and told me that her reason was because of strange things have happened to her when she went down there alone. I must have read her mind because I said, "You're going to tell me there's a ghost down there, am I right?" I was met with a stunned silence for a split second, and then she nodded her head. She told me not to think that she was crazy, but something happened to her that frightened her to the point that she would not go there alone. I told her that I did not think she was crazy, because I had my fair share of paranormal encounters myself. I asked her to tell me what happened. Trish had already been there a couple of years when I started. She said that shortly after she started working there, that she went to the basement to get to supplies one day. She wasn't thinking of anything except getting what she needed and getting back to the floor to work. She had collected a bag full of items and turned around to head back towards the elevator when she saw a young woman with blondish hair staring at her with a startled look on her face. She noticed that she could almost see right through the woman. Trish screamed and dropped her bag and ran full steam ahead to the elevator. When she reached the first floor, she grabbed a security guard and pleaded with him to escort her back to the basement. He could see that she was visibly shaken, so he didn't ask any questions. He just went with her downstairs to retrieve her bag of supplies and bring her back up. Trish said that the guard must have thought that she was either certifiable or just an hysterical woman. She didn't care, but felt better when he went with her. By this point, Trish was wringing her hands nervously. I told her to calm down. I told her that she shouldn't so much fear the ghosts, as living are much more of a problem. I was attempting to inject a little levity into the situation to get her to relax a bit. She wasn't amused. I explained that the woman was once a living, breathing person, and possibly her life was cut unexpectedly short by a medical mishap. After all, this is a hospital, and people do die here. Not very pleasant, but a fact. She then eased back onto the couch with an understanding grin on her face. She said that she still did not want to go down there alone, but wanted to know that if we talked to the ghost, if it would help. My reply was that we'll find out the next time we head that way. Of course, the situation arose when we needed more supplies again. We went together. Trish wouldn't have it any other way. I introduced ourselves to our unseen hostess and explained that we were not there to harm or bother her, but we merely needed some important items so that we could do our work. We began gathering some supplies when Trish sounded annoyed and announced that all the paper towels had been moved. They were always in a specific spot on a certain shelf, and now she couldn't find them. We conducted a search of every shelf and could not locate the much-needed paper towels. By then, I was slightly exasperated. I wanted to know what idiot moved something that we go through so fast and absolutely needed to find. After that statement, we both heard a muffled but heavy thud on the floor several feet behind us. Trish let out a small shriek, and I admit that I gasped. However, when we looked behind us, there on the floor was a large, banded-together carton of paper towels. I uttered a special thank you to our unseen benefactor for her kind assistance. I told her that we never would have seen them way up on the top of the shelves where they were had she not helped us. It may have been my imagination, but I almost thought I heard a soft, feminine voice respond saying, "You're welcome." I'm not sure, but I thought that I heard it. We complained to our supervisor when we got back to the floor. We told him that we would have to be 7 feet tall to see where those paper towels were moved to. We told him that we used a long broom to knock them down to retrieve them because we thought a ladder would be too shaky for either of us. He apologized and promised to have them placed back where it would be convenient and safe for us to access them. There was no way that we were going to tell him that a ghost helped us to get them. Not too sure that he would buy that. Catty-cornered behind the hospital was the unwed mother's home that housed the girls and women until they had their babies. The home was primarily where the SA personnel worked. They ran the offices, made the meals, taught school courses, and did job training for the girls. I used to go outside sometimes for my lunch break and walk around to unwind before going back on duty. On some of those occasions, I would be looking at the home. I would notice an older woman come out of the side of the concrete stairwell outside of the building. She would then descend the steps and go over to the little brick building that housed old furniture and what have you. She wore the traditional navy blue uniform with a blue cap on her head that the SA personnel wore. I never gave any thought to it. I knew that the Salvation Army personnel operated and worked over there, so no big deal, I thought. She looked rather matronly with her graying hair pinned back. She always seemed focused on doing a specific task. She didn't even notice me standing in front of the building, and I saw no reason to disturb her from whatever she had to do. Trish and I were on the hospital's second floor cleaning one time. A couple SA captains came walking through chatting with the nurses, asking about how many beds were occupied, how the nurseries were doing, and if there was anything they were needing that they could order for the stations, that kind of thing. After talking to them, they gravitated over to Trish and me. They were very polite, and they asked us how we were doing. Did we like working there? Pretty much just casual small talk, after which they departed to go to another area in the facility. We still had more work to do, though. We entered the nurses' lounge to begin cleaning there. Trish did the wastebasket while I cleaned the restroom, and we both began dusting the lockers and mopping the floors. We were having a conversation about the facility and the other floor we had left to clean. I wonder why we never had to go to the home in the back of the hospital to clean over there. Trish told me that was the girls and women that reside there are responsible for doing that, so we were not required over there. Neither Trish nor I had ever been in the home, but we wondered about it in our conversation. I told her about the uniformed lady that I kept seeing over there. About that time, one of the nurses came in to retrieve an item from her locker. She overheard me describing the lady that I kept seeing. She got a funny expression on her face and went over to the door and closed it. She then introduced herself to Trish and I. She inquired about the lady that I was talking about. I told her what I'd noticed frequently about the woman, how she comes out of the building, down the outside steps, and goes into the little breakout building. I described her to this nurse, who began getting a little pale. She told me that she had seen this woman periodically. So what was a big deal? The following is the conversation relating to this woman that we saw. This is where it got interesting and a little bit scary. The nurse. Did you ever notice the side door of the home open or closed when the woman walked out? Me. Now that you mention it, I don't think I have. Did you ever see her walk through a door on the side of the outbuilding that she went into? I don't recall seeing her open a door to go inside. The nurse. It took me a while before I noticed those seemingly innocuous little details. But once I took note of what I was seeing, it dawned on me that I was seeing something far from normal. She told us that she was embarrassed to discuss it with her co-workers, so she did some research on her own. She knew a nurse that regularly worked over in the home. She asked questions, but was trying not to sound ridiculous. Apparently, the nurse that worked over there figured out what the questions were leading to. This other nurse confided in her that she was seeing Sister Doris. Suddenly, the inquisitive nurse felt a bit sheepish. So she was seeing a lady that works there? The reply that she received just about floored her. The other nurse told her that Sister Doris had passed away over 50 years ago. Her picture was on the hall wall inside as one of the dedicated Salvation Army personnel that devoted her life to the well-being of those who enter here. In other words, she was really seeing the ghost of Sister Doris, and so was I. She told her that Sister Doris was a saintly and kind woman. She never bothers or hurts anyone. In fact, they were very fond of Sister Doris. I could scarcely believe what I was hearing, that they didn't mind sharing the home with a ghost. According to the nurse who we were talking to, she and the unwed home nurse told her that Sister Doris is extremely helpful over there. Sometimes she straightens out the beds for the girls, or they'd get done doing laundry and leave to gather more, only to come back and see sheets, towels, and what have you neatly folded. Some of the girls were even comforted by Sister Doris a few times, not realizing that she was not really there. Of course, the people working over there weren't about to tell them. Sister Doris would go outside to bring in extra supplies that were needed inside the home. The little brick building was once where the supplies were stored. Sister Doris often volunteered to go out there to bring in whatever was needed quite often. She was the type of woman that always went above and beyond in everything she did. When the nurse got done telling us all of this, all I could say was, apparently, the good Sister Doris wished to remain in her capacity as a caregiver and comforter. She wanted to continue serving a needful purpose even in the afterlife. They agreed with that scenario. I commented how very solid and real she appeared. I admit that my first experience was seeing a solid-looking, full-bodied apparition. I worked there for 2 years, and I saw Sister Doris sporadically until I secured a better job elsewhere, but I wasn't alarmed at seeing her anymore. She was a fine lady. I never confided those incidents to Bill. Bill was the type that wouldn't really believe it unless he saw it with his own eyes. Even then, he would be a bit skeptic. I maintain a practical sense of rationale in regard to what I have encountered. I will evaluate all of the logical possibilities before I concede that something is truly paranormal. Once you eliminate the logical, then what remains is beyond logic and should just be accepted as such. There is an unseen world around us if we only acknowledge it. Something to think about. That is going to do it for today. Thank you everyone for listening, and I hope that you enjoyed the stories. If you did, could you please rate and review on Spotify and Apple Podcasts? A 5-star rating really helps others to find the show. Don't forget to join us on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe on YouTube. And just one more time, next week is a week off for the podcast, but we will be back on March 1st with a brand new episode. But once again, thank you everyone for listening, and make sure to keep those doors and windows locked, and stay ready for Ohio Unsolved.